The clarinet isn't exactly a cool instrument. It's not an instrument that most kids are going to grow up dreaming of playing one day. No offence to clarinetists out there. I learned violin and viola, so my rank on the coolness scale isn't exactly bragworthy. Well, clarinets might not be the very coolest instrument out there, but it might be the name of one of the coolest audio products out there. Let's talk about it so you can decide. The Clarinet is a portable DAC and headphone amp made by Dethonray. They sent me this Pro version of the Clarinet for review, but they have no influence over this video. The Clarinet Pro costs $449 and is an upgraded version of the standard Clarinet. According to Dethonray, the Pro version has more output power and improved soundstaging capabilities. I haven't heard the standard version, so I can't confirm any of that. What I can confirm though, is that the Clarinet Pro sounds really good. Another point of difference between the Pro version and the standard version Clarinet is that the Pro version here doesn't have a 3.5mm output. Instead, it's got a 4.4mm balanced output only, with the 3.5mm being converted into an optical or coaxial input. So you can connect the Clarinet Pro to something like a CD transport that might not have a USB output. What that also means is that you can't use the Clarinet Pro with a 3.5mm or any sort of unbalanced connection on headphones. And while we're talking about what you see on the face of the Clarinet, if you want to call it that, we should talk about this volume knob. The Clarinet Pro is immediately identifiable by the use of a gold volume knob as opposed to the purpley coloured one on the standard Clarinet. This volume knob adjusts a digital volume control internally, and that's both great and not so great. It's great in the sense that you're going to have perfect channel matching at any level on the control and excellent signal quality. It's not so great in the sense that as you turn up the volume on the Clarinet Pro or down, it's going to jump occasionally in small increments. In other words, it's not a completely linear adjustment like you would get with an analog volume control, but at the same time, unless you're doing anything silly with it, it's not going to jump in huge, scary increments and suddenly get really loud. If you're adjusting it gradually as you would with an analog control, you may just occasionally hear a little jump. And to me, it's the preciseness of the volume control, and what I mean by that is the channel balance that it ensures at every single level, and another superpower of the Clarinet that makes it really handy for both IEM and headphone users alike. We'll talk about the superpower in just a moment, but before we do, let's talk about the sound quality of the Clarinet. The Clarinet Pro uses an AK4493 DAC chip and extracts a wonderfully clean and natural sound with it. The team at Dethonray seem to have a lot of experience at producing devices that create a clean, natural and engaging sound. And that's definitely on show here too. Comparing the Clarinet Pro with the much smaller Questyle M18i proves that the Clarinet Pro can deliver a more spacious and resolving sound. And the difference is quite significant. The M18i is already an excellent device, but the upgrade in the sense of soundstage size and instrument separation is significant going to the Clarinet Pro. That's not a knock on the M18i though, because it's got Bluetooth and it's eminently more pocketable than the Clarinet Pro. In other words, they're both quite different devices for different situations. Tonally, they're both very similar devices in the sense that neither is particularly enhancing a specific part of the frequency range. Although I do feel like the Clarinet Pro focuses vocals a little bit better in the soundstage and delivers them with just a little bit more weight. And that could be because of the greater sense of separation that I mentioned earlier. There may also be a tiny bit more sense of density to the sound from the Clarinet Pro, and what I mean by that is not warmth or thickness, just that each sound has a tiny bit more sense of presence in space. On the other hand, there was an area or a couple of areas that the M18i had an edge over the Clarinet Pro, and that was that I felt like the M18i had slightly better refinement in the top end. The Clarinet Pro was maybe just a tiny bit grainier by comparison, but again, grainy is probably the wrong word, it's overstating it. And then at the other end, I felt like the M18i had a tighter control over the bass notes. And so some might prefer those aspects of the M18i's sound, even though to get it, you're trading off or losing out on a little bit of soundstage size and separation of sounds. However, having just said that the Clarinet Pro was maybe a tiny bit grainier in the top end compared to the M18i, I probably now need to tell you about the Clarinet Pro's superpower. Like many of Dethonray's products, you can change the sound of the Clarinet Pro by changing the firmware you've installed. There are 3 main versions of firmware for the Clarinet. And then there's a fourth one that's designed to reduce the output levels for people using very sensitive IEMs or even very sensitive headphones. That's going to give you more range on the volume dial, which I didn't find I needed, but if you're listening quietly with very sensitive IEMs, you might be glad of that option. And so what these different firmwares mean is that you can buy the Clarinet Pro from a place like Linsol, and then once you get it, you can adjust its sound to suit your specific tastes, or the specific headphones or earphones you're using. And I mention Linsol here because they're a retailer of the Clarinet Pro, but they're also the sponsor of this video. Linsol specialise in head-fi and portable audio with some fantastic brands and a great website. One thing I particularly like about their website is you can search for products by their tuning style or their tonal character. Or of course you can just go to your favourite brands or shop which sales and specials are on at the time. And so if you need an upgrade in your portable audio or head-fi setup, just visit Linsol using the link in the description down below and support them like they're supporting me and the channel. Now let's get back to the Clarinet Pro and start off by talking about the firmware version referred to as Rhapsody. Listening with the Dunu Arashi headphones, the Rhapsody firmware produced a sound that was rich and smooth, but it still had plenty of crispness and detail as well. And I think the upper mid-range from the Rhapsody firmware is probably the crispest or the most emphasized, even though it's not massively emphasized, but I think it's the most emphasized of the three different firmwares. I say three firmwares in the sense of the three main firmwares, not the IEM high sensitivity one. Swapping to the Rock firmware involved a quick connection to the PC and running an application that's going to re-flash the chip inside the Clarinet Pro. And you can download everything you need, such as the application and the firmware, from the Dethonray website. I was concerned that the delay created by having to re-flash the firmware in the Clarinet Pro as I tried to listen to each of the firmwares would make it really difficult to tell the difference between them, but I really shouldn't have worried. The Rock firmware sounded obviously different from what I'd heard with the Rhapsody firmware, but it didn't sound exactly as I'd expected based on the description on the Dethonray website. To me, the Rock firmware made the sound come across as more linear from top to bottom and a little bit thicker overall as a result. In other words, I didn't hear any of that sense of upper mid-range emphasis from the Rock firmware like I had from the Rhapsody firmware. With the Rock firmware, Mark Knopfler's vocals in Got to Have Something were a bit more present and prominent compared to the other instruments in the mix. It was enjoyable if you want to focus in on the vocals, but for me it was lacking some of the articulation that I'd enjoyed from the Rhapsody firmware. It was on to the Serenade firmware next, and that meant another pause and another connection to my computer. The results were definitely worth it. The Serenade firmware is easily my preference of these three. There's an improved sense of articulation and mid-range clarity when compared to the Rock firmware, but without the excess upper mid-range emphasis of the Rhapsody firmware. That makes the Serenade firmware very detailed, articulate and resolving, but still smooth and easy to enjoy without any sense of fatigue. Of course, this is just my preferences, so let us know in the comments below if you have a clarinet, which firmware do you prefer and why? With the Serenade firmware now firmly entrenched in the Clarinet Pro as my favourite, I was curious to know how the Clarinet Pro would fare against the excellent KN-RU9 DAC and headphone amp. And the Clarinet Pro came very, very close, but I did still slightly prefer the sound of the much more expensive KN-RU9. That said, the battery life is way better from the Clarinet Pro because it's not trying to power tubes, and it's going to give you up to about 7 hours of battery life compared to a bit over 4 hours of battery life from the RU9. The trade-off is that the RU9 can deliver a sound that's just a little bit more euphonic, which is a fancy word that means more pleasing to the ears, but the Clarinet Pro is still an excellent DAC and headphone amp. And that gives us a bit of a clue that in the scheme of things, the Clarinet Pro is a slightly smoother and richer sounding device compared to some other devices like the Nypo A100 that are much more along the lines of a lean and neutral sound. And so if you do know that you prefer a leaner and more neutral sound, you could buy the Clarinet Pro and use the Rhapsody firmware to get just a little bit more sense of bite and presence and attack up top, or you could hit the subscribe button and wait for the review of the Nypo A100. For now though, let's wrap this up by saying that the Clarinet Pro is a fantastic portable DAC and headphone amp. It's another great sounding device from Dethonray. It's musical, it's wonderfully simple, and therefore it's very easy to use. It then balances excellent power output with fantastic sound quality and pretty good battery life as well. If that sounds good to you and you want one for yourself, I'll put a link in the description down below as always where you can go and buy one. Or if you do have some more money to spend and you want to experience euphony for yourself so you can go around using big words too, then I've pinned a video here at the end explaining why I absolutely fell in love with the KN-RU9, so watch that one next. But for now, a huge thanks to YouTube channel members, also to channel Patreon members, and of course to those of you who leave super thanks on videos like this one. And until next time, happy listening, be kind to each other, and I'll see you here again soon on Passion for Sound.